Hello, this is Emma, and today we're going to go over part 2 of our discussion of the open question AP Lit prompt. So if you remember from our overview video, the first thing that we're always going to look at is the prompt. So here's the prompt that we're going to look into today. If you want to pause the video right now and make an outline, kind of go about the essay how you would, and then come back and see how I go through it, that works as well. We're going to move on and go kind of into depth into the breaking down the prompt and then ultimately kind of getting an outline for the essay. So if you remember from the overview again, there are going to be three main parts to this prompt. It's going to be one, the introductory section that gives some background information on the topic that it wants you to discuss. Then it's going to give you some criteria for the material that it wants you to pick. And then finally it's going to give you a task, and that is what's going to form the foundation of your thesis and your essay. So reading through the prompt, a Bildungsroman, or coming-of-age novel, recounts the psychological or moral development of its protagonist from youth to maturity when this character recognizes his or her place in the world. I would definitely categorize that as introductory or background information. It's setting up for the criteria, which comes next. Select a single pivotal moment in the psychological or moral development of the protagonist as a Bildungsroman. So now it's giving you the criteria for the character that you have to pick, and it's going to now narrow your focus on, maybe you're going to be thinking of a few books right now. And then finally it says, write a well-organized essay that analyzes how that single moment shapes the meaning of the work as a whole. So now you have a specific task. You're going to analyze a moment in a literary work that somehow relates to the overarching meaning, and it somehow has to do with the maturation of a character. So here's our entire prompt, but if you remember, this list of suggested works is really just that, a suggestion. And if you've done AP Lit, I would really just read the prompt, and as you're reading, think about books that fit in your mind instead of going through all these suggested works and kind of trying to pick out from there. So without looking at that list of works, a few things come to my mind. I think that I could potentially use King Lear as an example. I also, pulling from my outside reading, I've read The Orphan Master's Son, which kind of has a similar pivotal moment in an individual's maturation and in their coming of age. But that's not one that I read in AP Lit. And finally, I have Invisible Man. Say that after further inspection, I've come to the conclusion that I can write my best essay on Invisible Man. All three of these prompts would work, but I know this book best, and I have some quotes with me. And so right here, I'm going to put a disclaimer. If you haven't read Invisible Man, the rest of this video might not make that much sense, because I'm going to be discussing themes within the book, not the plot itself. So with that, let's continue on to an essay in which I would discuss how Invisible Man ties to that criteria of an individual facing a pivotal moment in his coming of age, his or her, but in this case his, and how that relates to the overall meaning of a text. The first thing that I would have to do is to decide what that pivotal moment is. And there are a few different options that I have within the book Invisible Man. But I've decided that the most pivotal moment that I see that I could discuss is that moment where an Invisible Man is trapped and he has to burn his high school diploma, his Brotherhood ID, and this Brotherhood anonymous letter, and then the Sambo doll from Todd Clifton. And I chose this one moment when he's trapped in this darkness because he has to burn his past. He has to burn all of these elements of his supposed identity to really begin to see himself for what he truly is with a much more complex identity. And this one moment has a very clear structure to me. I can use each of these materials that he burns as a reflection of the identity he is destroying in order to see his new identity. Transitioning from this general brainstorm to an introduction, you'll want to keep in mind that general to specific chart that we've used in past videos, in that the introduction is going to transition from general background information about the book to a specific argument that somehow ties into the theme of the book and the task of the prompt. Here, the beginning of my introduction might read, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man tells the tale of a young black man in early 20th century America attempting to find his place in society in the face of racism, manipulation, and betrayal. Here is a general overview of the book Invisible Man, giving a little bit of context for the reader. Next, I have this kind of intermediate section of my introduction that discusses a slightly more specific part of the book and how it relates to the prompt, but it doesn't quite get to my main point yet. And that might read, the unnamed narrator undergoes many transformations throughout the novel as he continues down the windy path towards self-discovery. So I kind of introduced this idea of bildungsroman and self-discovery and identity, but I haven't quite gotten to my argument. Okay, now before you become completely overwhelmed by the amount of writing on this page, like I was when I started transcribing my essay, I want you to keep in mind that this is not the only structure for a thesis. It's merely an example of how I chose to structure my own essay, and also it kind of shows that in an in-class essay, your writing is not necessarily going to be the most concise or the most polished. And that's okay, because it really is, it's 40 minutes. It's going to be a rough draft. So let's read through this kind of thesis-specific part of my introduction and see how it leads into the rest of my essay. So I say, one particularly pivotal moment for the Invisible Man comes near the end of the novel, as he finds himself trapped beneath a manhole, forced to burn his high school diploma, the anonymous letter he received at the Brotherhood, and Todd Clifton's sample doll for light. The literal burning representing a figurative release of his past attempts to live by other people's expectations. So here I set myself up for 3 main paragraphs. This what the high school diploma means, what the anonymous letter means, and what the sample doll's significance is. And I'm somehow going to be specific about what the expectations were and how they differed for each of those scenarios. Keep in mind also that this essay by no means requires the introduction 3-body paragraph conclusion model. It oftentimes, the open question is also more open in structure, and you're going to find yourself writing more than 3-body paragraphs. Next, in my introduction and my thesis really, I say, this is not his final transformation, but his realization about the true complexity of his identity and the subsequent inability of groups to understand or appreciate this complexity, much less impose a new identity on him, lays the foundation for his ultimate self-actualization. And so here's where I get to the point where I address the part of the prompt that asks me to discuss the overarching theme of the novel. And in Invisible Man, it really is this idea of a complex identity and discovering your identity for yourself. As my thesis dictates, I might start off my first body paragraph with a description of the burning of his high school diploma and its significance. So perhaps I'd say that burning his high school diploma, the Invisible Man rejects Bledsoe's idea of working within the white-dominated system to gain power. Because Bledsoe represents this false hope of the system, and in doing so, he quits this cycle that he's played into of hope and disappointment, and ultimately the narrator sees that he has to rise above pleasing others. He is ill of affirmation, and that would be a quote to use on the essay that would make your argument that much stronger. Next, following the roadmap planned out by my thesis, I would discuss the burning of his Brotherhood identification. So I would say that perhaps the letter from the Brotherhood represents a group mentality that has been dictating his actions and defining his identity, and ultimately that burning it not only rejects the notion that identity can be imposed on him, but he also realizes the superficiality of the Brotherhood identity, because, if it's really an identity, how can it disappear as it is burned? And further with this group mentality, in burning this identification, he also rejects the idea that organized groups can recognize individual identity, and that organized groups like the Brotherhood and schools, or even Ross and his nationalist movement, they leave no concern for the complexity of the individual. And so by burning these papers, the invisible man plunges outside of history, and that's a quote that I would use because that's one that is repeated many times within the novel. So by plunging out of history, he becomes historically irrelevant, but also gains some individual identity, realizing that the organization of these groups is not life, because life is chaotic, life is not simple, and that the narrator must now find a way to navigate the chaos on his own. Finally, I would discuss the Sambo doll. Again, just the idea of lighting this doll on fire represents a rejection of this idea that you can yes him to death and destruction, that you can put on a pretense of servility when truly you are inwardly defying the power structure. And perhaps the death of this idea is already represented by the death of his grandfather, who so espoused this idea. But also the idea that the burning of this Sambo doll reveals that if you live your life with the pretense of assumed inferiority, that you deny yourself the opportunity to find your own identity. And that's the conclusion I came to about the Sambo doll. Finally, with the conclusion, I might discuss the idea that he rejects the idea that 3 pieces of paper and a doll can represent an entire identity, and that he hasn't moved on to the point where he understands the answers, where he understands who he is, or what all the different facets of his identity amount to. But he does realize that part of coming to terms with one's own identity is living in this question and not having these neatly wrapped up answers. And that's how I would kind of tie together this transformation from imposed identity to chaotic unknown, the pivotal moment in the book, the coming of age. And here is what the outline of the essay might look like when all put together on one page. We have the intro, our 3 paragraphs. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to look like this. Many different kinds of essays work. You could have 7 paragraphs, you could have 4. Generally, you're going to have more on this kind of essay, like I said before. The conclusion is definitely something to try and consider in depth on the open question, because The point of the essay is to demonstrate critical thinking with an outside literary source. So if you can really step back and tie everything together with a thoughtful conclusion, that helps reveal your deeper understanding of the literary work as a whole. So that has been the review of a specific prompt for the open question portion of the AP Lit test. This one came from the 2013 AP. If you want to look it up and look up some other potential essays and analyses with different books, I hope that this has been helpful, and I believe that wraps it up for our writing series. Thank you for watching, as many as you have, and good luck writing your essays. Thanks.